This is Kriss McGrath, TDN, welcoming you to the next instalment of the Life's Work project, partnering with Keeneland and the University of Kentucky's Nunn Center for Oral History. We're so lucky that some of the most accomplished figures in our industry have agreed to share some memories of their lives and careers and the great horses and horsemen they've encountered. And we're very grateful today to have been invited to the historic Darby Dan farm to meet with Mr. John Phillips.
When E.R. Bradley came here out of the West, and he was a classic American story in his own right, he went west young man and was a gambler and had all sorts of tales of his adventures in the West. But he basically came back because of health issues, and he loved horses and loved to bet on horses and raise horses and race horses. And he came to this area with the intent of producing what was the quintessential horse farm at the time. Let's even go back further than that, because the farm, while it was surveyed by Daniel Boone, was essentially a subsistence farm until somewhere in the 1850s when it became a standard-bred farm. It's classic bluegrass here. I mean, it's Murray loam soil on top of a cursed environment. We have sinkholes open up all the time. The topsoil is incredibly deep, incredibly pure, constantly rejuvenating. And so it was a successful standard-bred farm, albeit not as big as E.R. Bradley would take it. And that was Idlehour Stock Farm on Old Frankfort Pike, which is here. And he basically laid out this entire farm. And it was back then a living commune, if you will. I mean, everything that one would need on the farm was here on the farm, from mules to washhouses to living quarters, to its own fire engines, to its own dairy, gardens, even it had its own chapel on this land. And so it was more than just a farm, it was his community. And he was a very classic gentleman, Irish Catholic, very proud and very devout to his religion, quite generous, quite charitable. And yet he had this passion for gambling. He enjoyed his bourbon, never had any kids, but he had a casino, if you will, down in Palm Beach was his largest one, although he did start the racetrack in New Orleans called the Fairgrounds, which is still there today. And he had, in his history is in and of itself a remarkably entertaining history. He had more Derby entrants than anybody in history, and that probably will never be broken. He won the Kentucky Derby 4 times. He had a railhead here that he would load up his horses to go to Pimlico or Saratoga, and he followed them around with great enthusiasm. And so we have pictures of him, on horseback with his Derby trophies and all the like. And this farm really is as much a salute to him as it is to Darby Dan and the Galbreath family. My grandfather, John Galbreath, who was born in Derby, Ohio, an interesting side note, was always passionate about horses. And horses, his uncle had a livery stable, and he was a country boy. He was a total farm boy. So he took care of all manner of animals, including horses, and he loved to ride. And he eventually bought a very fast polo pony that he took to a local fairgrounds and won a race and thought that was really cool, and so he got into horses. What happened, though, is that the horse racing industry in Ohio wasn't near what the reputation was, understandably, here in Kentucky. So as his interest grew, he wanted to move down to, not move himself, but have an establishment, a small farm down here so we could have that connection. He ended up buying a piece of E.R. Bradley's farm post E.R. Bradley. E.R. Bradley died in 1946. The transition there came in 46. E.R. Bradley, who had no immediate heirs, the estate was busted up, and so across the street became King Ranch, and the farm to the east of us here was split in two. One was Donata and one became Colonel Davis's old farm. And years later, then, when grandfather wanted to expand his operation, he looked to this operation, which was then owned for a period of time by a family called the Moores. They were a prominent New York family, I believe. And they really had not had the kind of bloodstock that was carrying them far into the industry. So ultimately, grandfather came and negotiated with them to buy the farm, leaving them a life estate on the house there, in which they lived till 1970, I believe. The last of them passed away. So that farmhouse was the manor house was kind of off limits, because they actually lived there for many years, for approximately 15 years after grandfather bought the farm.
Among the Boones inherited with Darby Down Farm was its manager, a great horseman and great character, Olin Gentry.
Olin Gentry is an interesting story. He came with E.R. Bradley and eventually rose to the manager of Idlehour Stock Farm, I believe, as a young man, and was associated with this farm. Now, Olin Gentry was a character of classic proportions as well. Very much a Southerner, very much a gentleman, but he had his Southern values. I'll leave it that way. And so when he basically was freed up from his obligation, grandfather became associated with him. And he essentially then created Darby Dan, and really deserves a lot of credit for assembling some of the bloodstock that E.R. Bradley had and that others had. Even to this day, I mean, his mark is on the pedigrees that we still have here after so many generations. John Galbreath had a basic principle, and it's really reflected in almost everything he did. And that is, you hire the best people you can, and then you let them do what they're hired for. And that was very true in baseball, too, which kind of runs a very parallel course to Darby Dan, his management and ownership of the Pittsburgh Pirates for decades. He really deferred to Olin quite a bit when it came to particularly the brood mares and matings, almost exclusively. There were a lot of what at the time might have been called crazy business judgments that I think Olin might not have gone along with. Grandfather, it's a Horatio Alger story, which is a classic American expression to say coming from nothing. Because his family in central Ohio was very poor and large, and in an agricultural community. But he was very clever, insightful, and extremely hardworking. He loved work. It was passion for him. And in fact, everything he did was passionate. He would immerse himself in, whether it was the farm, whether it was horses, whether it was agriculture, he just loved it. And real estate certainly was intriguing to him. He was very proud of being an American. The notion of rugged individualism. And if you sort of studied the connections of his families, with his family, with his uncles and his father's father and the like, classic Americans going all over the country, making fortunes, losing fortunes, just very sort of entrepreneurial, go-for-it attitude. He was never afraid of failure. Some things did fail for him, but he never looked back. It's kind of, he always said the only value in failure is to the learning process and then let it go. So he's very positive, loved people, always was intrigued with people, and I think that was one of his best qualities, particularly when he was younger, because he could relate and did relate and enjoyed relating to farmers working out in the field.
Those personal skills were harnessed to a no less exceptional business acumen.
One of his biggest projects was in Hong Kong, called Mei Fu. And Mei Fu was to accommodate 90,000 people, and mostly in vertical structures. So he pioneered a lot of those kinds of things, and then his association with corporate America did eventually allow him to build skyscrapers all over the world. It was a real transition, from small town. Oh, grandfather was a stitch. First of all, I need to, as Churchill said, warts and all, he was very demanding. So in our family, there were to be no slackers, and that was the hard and fast rule. College was not an option. You were going to college, you were going to do well, you were going to study hard, you were going to work through college. That was something he always insisted upon. So he was demanding, and he could be very tough. Tremendously charming guy, wonderfully nice guy, but don't cross him. And you are, what's that saying, to whom much is given, much is also expected. I think that comes from Luke. And he was very much in that mindset. I think his plan was defined by his passion more than anything else. And he had an undeniable confidence that things will just work out. So it was crazy money that he paid for swabs, perhaps even crazier money that he paid for Ribot. But he never looked back. He was just confident that it would all work. His business plan was not what we would anticipate in this day and age, because it was a different age. It was the age of the Whitneys and the Vanderbilts and the Firestones and the big prominent East Coast families and a few oil families and the like. But it wasn't something that he said, oh, I'm going to come down here and participate so I can make more money. It's just, I'm going to participate because I enjoy the people, I enjoy the sport, I enjoy the horse, and like the challenge. And committed to the notion that if he provided good broodmares, and of course Banquet Bell, I'm not sure was what one might consider a good broodmare at the time, but proved to be a sensational broodmare, producing horses like Chateaugay and Primonetta, and actually the list goes on from there. Chateaugay was a horse that came to himself at the exact right time. He did win the Bluegrass here. Not by a lot, I think it was 2 lengths maybe. But he was coming to himself really, really well. And then he went to the Derby, and obviously he won the Derby. The disaster that you're referring to was the fact that the exercise rider thought he was really unbeatable, and this was the family story, and wanted to show everybody how fast he could run. So he breezed him 5 days before the Preakness, and essentially, as I was told, set a new track record. That was not told a lot, not spoken of, no excuses were given other than within the family, like, you kind of shut the door and then let yourself vent. But he didn't complain about it. And he was disappointed and not happy, but accepted the Preakness defeat. Not that it was a bad defeat, by the way, but nonetheless, he didn't win. And then he turned around in the Belmont with some normal training schedule and won there too. So that was really unfortunate for Chateaugay, because I think there's something to be said. It's an excuse, but it is a meritorious one, I think. So that was in '63.
One of Galbraith's most audacious coups was the acquisition of the last masterpiece of an iconic European breeder.
The Ribot story is an interesting one in that Ribot, he raced in the mid-50s, 54, 55, 56, I think, and was phenomenal. I mean, he was another Tessio product, the brilliant breeder, Italian breeder from Dormello. And the notion of Ribot coming to the United States was going to be very difficult. So as I understood it, as it was sort of told to me, big money was offered. And Tessio, and not so much Tessio, because Mr. Tessio had passed away, and his wife was in charge of the estate at that time. She was very reluctant to sell Ribot to Americans, largely for patriotic reasons. I mean, if you understand, 10 years after the war, Italy had been decimated, their self-esteem and their national pride had been destroyed. And she was very reluctant to just have the Americans come in and throw a bunch of money at her horses and her husband's horses and walk away with the spoils of war, as was sort of her mindset. Grandfather understood that, and as grandfather would do, very cleverly, I think, said, look, don't sell your national treasure, but you can rent your national treasure. Lease it to me for a few years, and then he can come back if you really want him to come back. But if you lease him, you can always say he's still an Italian horse. And that's what happened. But again, the issue was quality there. If I heard grandfather say it once, I heard him say it 1,000 times. It takes the same amount of money to raise a bad horse as it does a good horse. And he believed in quality. And so that's the Ribot story. And then, of course, that horse came here and stayed here beyond the 5 years. The lease was renewed and died here, and he's buried here.
Ribot had a notorious temperament and left a literal and lasting mark on his stall. But for sheer charisma, there was no horse in his grandfather's era that made a bigger impression on Phillips than Graustark.
Graustark is an exceptional story. He was, first of all, he did have presence. When I was 14, grandfather said, come on, we're going to fly down to Kentucky and we're going to go to Keeneland and we're going to watch this horse. And his name is Graustark. I was aware of Graustark because we all at Christmas would talk about horses all the time, and he was excited about this horse. So I had not seen him. And the buzz at the racetrack, this is the race before the Bluegrass, was phenomenal. And I was like, you could hear people, well, should we go see him? I can't wait to see him. And I had no idea who the him really was. But in fact, I went down, my hand in grandfather's hand, to see Graustark. And I can remember my very first gaze at Graustark. And it was, whoa. He was very masculine, a unique color, a liver chestnut, totally dappled, very masculine, very much on his toes and bold. I can remember him exceedingly well. I can't say that about every horse I've ever seen, but that was an unforgettable image. And then the race itself, I believe it was kind of a 7 furlong, the beard course, something like that, 6, 7 furlongs, which was shockingly short for a prep for the Bluegrass. He was a phenomenal looking, phenomenal athlete with a huge stride and amazing presence. It probably is the one thing, if I'd have to point to any singular event that got me involved in horse racing, it was seeing Graustark at Keeneland. Remarkable. And it was very disappointing that he broke his coffin bone in the Bluegrass on a sloppy track.
Welcome to horse racing.
And welcome to horse racing. I remember I wasn't down here for that race, but I do remember coming home and asking my grandmother, Phillips, how much did the horse win by? And she said he got beat. I said, it can't be. And he did. And of course, fought valiantly with a broken coffin bone, but it was a tragedy. And ironically, he bred nonetheless that first year right off the track, which we would never do now because you'd have no chance of being a prominent sire with a book of 15 or 10 mares. But he did, and he had such presence that he was able to go on and be a very useful, in particular, well, more than useful, but in particular, a great broodmare sire. And it's still prominent in all our pedigrees today. And I even look for it in fact, I look for Ribot influences in any Derby, Kentucky Derby pedigrees, because that is a tremendous source of two-turn stamina. Rosanna out of Spring-a-Doo is His Majesty, and then Spring-a-Doo was out of Rosanna Soaring. The interesting thing to me is that Graustark produced the second Breeders' Cup Classic winner, and His Majesty produced a Kentucky Derby winner. Though Graustark had several horses in the Kentucky Derby, none ever won, and His Majesty was the really more of the dirt-oriented sire of the two.
Galbraith's second Kentucky Derby winner, Proud Clarion, came 4 years after Chateaugay had won him his first.
That was 67. That Derby was a very unusual Derby in a couple of senses. One, it was in context of a lot of social strife, and they had called the National Guard out that day because there were some brutal social issues and riots and a lot of social unrest, and there was a threat at the time that a bomb was going to be placed in the grandstand of Churchill Downs and so on and so forth. In addition to that, what made it even stranger, more eerie, was the fact that it was a totally foggy day and you couldn't see virtually anything. So standing in the grandstand, you just saw shadows going by on the backside. When he actually came around the quarter pole, you didn't know what horse it was. And then out of the mist, it's Proud Clarion, and everybody's scratching their head. Who? Where's Damascus? And it was Proud Clarion. And it was by far his best race that he ever ran. And he did set a new stakes record in the Romer later, but it was by far his best race. And he went off at 32-1 and shocked everybody, so including ourselves. But it was a bad track, and there were a lot of things going wrong. I know that grandfather told the story that he was debating whether he should even run because the conditions were so sloppy, and the weather was so bad. And he said, "Oh, heck, we're here. The other horses might fall down. Let's go ahead and try." And, history was written at 32-1.
In terms of turf history, however, Galbraith's Kentucky Derby success was only the prelude to something entirely without precedent.
Grandfather loved Hail to Reason, and so he had a desire to run in Europe. And he talked to Olin and said, "Olin, if Americans are sort of doing this now, let's take a shot at it. What horse do you think would work?" And Olin picked out the horse out of Bramley. And he said, "Fine, we'll send this Hail to Reason out of Bramley off to Europe, and let's pick out the best trainer that we possibly can." And that was, of course, Vincent O'Brien. And off he went with a ridiculous notion that some American just pick out one horse and go off to Europe and actually win the English Derby, but that was grandfather. He wanted to try it, and it turned out to be, brilliant. and that was Roberto. The sort of the side on that is that Roberto was named after a baseball player by the name of Roberto Clemente. Roberto Clemente was a great baseball player, and he came up in a very difficult era, as many of the players did. So I'm going to digress just a touch. I mentioned grandfather's approach: you hire the best and then let them manage. So when grandfather bought a baseball team, the Pittsburgh Pirates, he hired Branch Rickey. Grandfather was a classic American in the sense that he really believed in American values. And Branch Rickey was a very intentional hire. Branch Rickey, of course, was the general manager who brought Jackie Robinson to baseball. And that was very much an intentional hire because grandfather felt that United States needs to be a meritocracy in everything we did, including sports. So, although Branch Rickey was past his prime at that time, it did set the tone for the Pittsburgh Pirates. And so the Pittsburgh Pirates ended up recruiting, if you will, a lot of minority players. And they had a tremendous amount of talent, one of which was a Puerto Rican who spoke very little English, was available to be drafted essentially away from the Los Angeles Dodgers. And he was an African American as well. That was Roberto Clemente. And Roberto Clemente became maybe the classic symbol of what the Pittsburgh Pirates and what the Galbreath family stood for, and that was, this is America, it's a meritocracy. It doesn't make any difference if you're Italian American, Polish American, and it was not a popular thing. But it did drive Roberto Clemente, in a sense, closer to the Galbreath family. And the relationship really took a decade to develop because there was huge cultural gaps there between a farmer in Ohio and somebody born and raised in Puerto Rico. Nonetheless, it was a relationship that was cemented. So when Roberto Clemente became a close friend, also he was not just a friend, but he was a brilliant baseball player. Very sensitive, very committed human being. And so grandfather wanted to name what he thought was going to be one of his best horses in honor of Roberto Clemente, and that was Roberto the horse. And coincidentally, Roberto the horse was a great athlete as well. He was an Irish champion at 2, won the English Derby at 3, beat Brigadier Gerard in one of the great upsets of all time, and it was a great moment for grandfather. And sadly, Roberto Clemente was killed in a plane crash delivering humanitarian supplies to Nicaragua in 1972. I never got to see Roberto the horse, but he was very familiar with it, very aware of it, and it was a common joy that they shared.
Galbreath had become the first owner to win both the Kentucky Derby and the Epsom Original. And he found another medium for transatlantic traffic in the Thoroughbred gene pool in the great Seabird.
We can, debate these things endlessly and never have a resolution to it, but Seabird came again under the same theory: look, let's get the best. What grandfather had sensed and what he wanted to accomplish was, quite frankly, the classics. And America, particularly in the 60s, began to focus on speed. And the 70s surely manifested that desire. Grandfather, he thought that winning the Belmont was equally as fantastic as winning the Derby, which, of course, both are classic distances, but for him, those traditional classic distances, not sort of this revised American image of what you want to have in a racehorse, which was taking over, and clearly by the 70s it was becoming dominant. It was not of his interest. He was really oriented for classic races of 1.25 miles and 1.5 miles, and felt that Europe was the best repository of the genetics to accomplish that. So that was Ribot, and that was seabird, and you still see those influences today through Graustark, His Majesty, and then through Little Crimp.
Galbreath could employ his stallions in a fashion that would be rather less feasible in the commercial environment of today.
That was essentially the notion, and of course that harkens back to times long ago. That is something that's not done anymore, where somebody stands their own stallions and they breed their own mares to their own stallions, and then they go to the track with their own produce. That is clearly not the commercial market that we have today. But that was the market, that was the world that grandfather grew up in at the turn of the century. And it is the model that he followed, and he followed it because he enjoyed it. Again, it wasn't because this was primarily a commercial enterprise. This was a pursuit because he was passionate about the process, not just the winner's circle, but the process. And so he loved the notion of breeding horses that he would then race, that he would then, if they were fillies, stand at his farm, or stallions stand at his farm, and pull the two together. And I know this is one of the influences of Olin Gentry, because Olin Gentry, in fact, it was in this very office where I heard Olin Gentry talk about creating matings to create other matings. In other words, you'd breed to get a filly out of this mare, so then you could breed that mare to this stallion who you were also going to create. That doesn't happen anymore. And thinking generationally like that, to me, was massively influential and also wonderfully unique, because that signifies that it's the process which is a lot of the joy, as opposed to just, winning the big bucks and getting the trophy and getting your picture on the cover of Blood Horse magazine or something like that. And grandfather was very much, now it challenged him later in the 80s, because it really almost created to the death of Darby Dan. But it was a beautiful process. And you've forgotten Run Horse in there, because yes, Brian's Time was out of Kelly's Day, who was a Graustark Golden Trail, and Sunshine Forever, who was the champion that year, was the Graustark out of Outward Sunshine, who was out of Golden Trail. But the one you didn't mention was Dynaformer. And while Dynaformer was a little different, because he was out of a His Majesty mare, His Majesty being, and wasn't out of a Golden Trail mare, but the mare, the Grand Dam, was Golden Trail. So you really had three horses there that were almost genetically similar. And they all came in 1988. So Brian's Time is a classic contender, wins the Florida Derby, beating 49er, the 2-year-old champion of the year. Sunshine Forever comes on in the middle of the year and runs 3 brilliant races in a row and loses in a head bob in the Breeders' Cup Turf Classic. And then Dynaformer, who was the least athletic and by far the least attractive, and that's being kind, but who proved to be the prepotent stallion. Sunshine Forever was conformationally a little different. He was low-slung, short-legged, and tended to produce that. Brian's Time, who was beautifully put together, but was a little bit on the smaller side. But you couldn't stand Brian's Time and Sunshine Forever together, and so the family sort of made a decision to go the other way, and he actually became a brilliant sire in Japan.
As Galbraith aged, John Phillips had to admit to himself that he was never going to get the same satisfaction out of a law career as he would in helping to steer Darby Dan into a new era.
I went off to law school, practiced law for 8 years, became a partner in a law firm, and honestly wasn't a very good lawyer, to be truthful. And I've often said if I could have remembered my law like I mysteriously can remember pedigrees, I probably would have been on the Supreme Court, but I couldn't. And the fact of the matter is, I wasn't looking forward to getting up in the morning as much as I look forward to it now. And every day it's like I'm excited to do what I do. and I love it. And I am so fortunate to have had the platform to participate in this industry and with horses and horse people. I've just been very blessed. But yeah, I made a career change that was pretty drastic.
As stewardship of Darby Down devolved to the next generation, Phillips was grateful to one filly in particular for a timely and resonant statement that the farm was here to stay.
You know, Soaring Softly, who was brilliant her 4-year-old year, she won 7 of 8 and was the turf champion and the winner of the inaugural filly and mare turf division. And it was wonderfully satisfying. My mother was still alive, and she got to thrill in that down at the old Gulfstream Park. And again, to breed and race, to me, is so much more satisfying than just to go to a sale and pick out a handsome horse. I'm not saying that's not great. I'm so glad that there are people that do, but it's not the peak of my pleasure and satisfaction. I like seeing the horses grow up. I like seeing the horses born. I like seeing the horses weaned and go through their maturation process and out in the field, and then to watch them come into the winner's circle. Well, it becomes a part of you, and it becomes a part of the family and everybody that works with them. Yeah, so Soaring Softly was a real key horse at a watershed moment, because my uncle had passed away in 95, my father had passed away in 98, my grandfather had passed away 10 years earlier than Soaring Softly. And it was just a signal, I think, to the family and really to the industry, hey, we're still here and we love it and we're going to go on with it. I often think my invitation to the Jockey Club, Denny Phipps called me the next spring and invited me to join the Jockey Club, and I'm pretty sure it was because of Soaring Softly and that thrill that she gave us all.
Phillips has helped Darby Down adapt to a radically different market. But whatever changes have been necessary, nothing will ever diminish his sense of privilege and responsibility as custodian of a farm with a unique and abiding presence in the bluegrass story.
And that's a product of coming out of the 80s, and really a product of coming out of the early 80s, because suddenly the thoroughbred industry became a global industry. So you had Coolmore, and then of course the Arabs, and that just drove everything. Plus a very favorable tax law, which Ronald Reagan changed in 1985. But that fueled an incredible infusion of capital into the horse industry, and it exploded. The net effect of that was that the old style, where you breed your own mares, you have your own stallion, and yes, you had some syndications. The Leslie Combs syndications were around. Hail to Reason was an example of that, which you participated in, Key to the Mint, and there were quite a few of those things emerging out of, in particular, the early 70s, late 60s, early 70s. But the notion that you're going to have a farm and keep your own mares and have no outside income and just survive on purse money and some sales, but not many, was really an antiquated business plan that, unless you were fabulously wealthy and willing to lose millions of dollars a year, was not going to fly in the early 80s. And grandfather was, as was my uncle, was a realist, and also they were humble people, and they never forgot that. And so to pay $500,000 for a stud season, no guarantee, or $850, as in the case of Seattle Slew, or $1 million in the case of Northern Dancer, almost necessitated that you go to the commercial market, because that's the only way you could really even come close to a chance of having some sort of rational business plan. And as a result, then you see this interbreeding a lot that was because you just didn't want to go out to the marketplace and pay $500,000 for Danzig or $1 million for Northern Dancer. And that changed our equation. And yes, we had some great success in 1988 and 1985 with the Breeders' Cup Classic and then Sunshine Forever. But the reality was that the world had become dominated by a commercial market. And now, where you had 10% of the people breeding for a commercial market, now you had 90% of the people breeding for a commercial market. And it was kind of tough. Started doing some part-time in 86. By 88, I was committed and we slowly revised. I mean, we had 70 mares, and only 4 of which were not ours. Now, we'll have 150 mares, 130 of which are not ours. So it's a different program now. And the stallions, we syndicated horses and we stand stallions and private management arrangements for some sole owners. We run the gambit. We have 12 stallions now, and it's a commercial operation. But the commercial operation allows us to continue our participation in the industry, and for which I'm really blessed. We are just stewards. So I plant trees here, and the staff will tell you, I'm crazy about my trees, the shade of which I'll never experience. But somebody will, because E.R. Bradley did, and because those that went before him took care of the land too. So yeah, at 67 years old, I'm still planting trees, and I'm still hoping that those pedigrees carry on, not only for decades, but for generations. And I love it, and I love it. That is what my epitaph is. It is this ground and these horses.